We all have ideas about what parenting should look like, whether those are shaped by our own parents or others around us. On top of that, Scripture and the thoughts of our spouse should also shape how we parent. This week, we give our perspective on how to navigate the difficulties of parenting as a team with your spouse. Thanks for listening.
Welcome to the Olive Shoots Family Podcast, where we talk about family and parenting, homesteading, and the things God is leading us towards. I'm Nathan.
And I'm Brittany. We've been married for 3 years, have one little boy, and just got our first piece of land where we plan to build and start our homestead. We are passionate about the family unit and getting back to the basics of the way God created us to live. We have big dreams and are learning what it looks like to pursue those dreams while first trusting God's leading.
Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. When we think about parenting and we step into parenting, whether that be for the first time or maybe you're on, kid number 3 or 4 or whatever, that you begin to process of what is our parenting style going to be, or maybe even for us as we're kind of stepping into being parents of 2, and our second is knocking on the door, very close to being here. That asking ourselves the question of what do we want to continue? What do we want to do the same? What do we want to keep? How is our parenting style going to change and evolve? Even as our first, Emerson, even as he gets older and we just analyze of how should we parent? How should we move forward in this? I think there's kind of 3 different ways in which we do that. There's kind of like a past, present, future idea to our parenting and how that develops that we're going to kind of get into. But that first way of how do we determine how we're going to parent and what that looks like? I think it begins with how we've already seen other parents parent, and primarily how we've seen our own parents parent. And then extending to, friends, family, that just how that has molded and shaped us and our idea of what parenting should look like at different stages of our kids' lives. And that can be both good examples or bad examples. One of the things that Brittany and I do sometimes is we just try to place ourselves in the shoes of other parents and ask ourselves we usually start it off by saying this is in no way a critique of other people's parenting or anything like that, but what would we do in that situation? How would we handle it? And again, it's not like a critique on them, but it's really an analyzing of what do we want our parenting to look like if that situation were to come up. And in a way, what we're doing is we're trying to figure out, okay, what do we want to pass on to our kids? How do we want to pass on the goodness that we've seen in other people's parenting to our kids?
And I think when we do that, it also kind of reveals to each other what our initial response or our initial idea would be personally. And so I think we've learned, because we don't just sit down and say what, in some hypothetical situation, we usually don't just make up a whole scenario on the spot and just talk about parenting randomly for no reason. Usually it's, like you said, we see a situation, or we see a way a parent handled something good, or a way a parent handled something that might not be working very well, and we're just what would we do if that was us? And then I think it gives us a chance to have those conversations, obviously way in advance, and we might not do anything that we talk about in the moment, but we right now just have a toddler, and so I think it's just kind of started those conversations, and hopefully when those things come up, it's not completely random and out of the blue. We've already had some type of conversation about it to where we at least know where each other is coming from in our thoughts.
Yeah, I also think when we do that, when we have those conversations, it kind of reveals to both of us of like where we have been, what our initial thought is, and how our perception of parenting in that moment or with that specific example, like how our minds have already been shaped, like what we already bring to the table, the baggage we already carry into our idea of what parenting should look like. It kind of reveals that those initial conversations reveal how we already think and what we already come to the table with, right?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of like that past example of, as we're forming our idea of parenting, as we're thinking through these different scenarios and like just trying to navigate what would we do, then we share these thoughts, and honestly, I don't know, a lot of the time, not every time, but a lot of the time we come from different places, and like,
I wouldn't say that different, but
I wouldn't say they're extremely different, but I mean, sometimes our initial conversation is like, maybe like I don't necessarily see it the exact same way, or there's a new perspective that one of us hadn't considered about it before.
Yeah, and I would also say that most of the time, your initial response and my initial response, by the time we talk about it for 5 minutes, is neither of ours response. Like, we kind of, like, it's very rare that, like, you're, like my idea was 100% the best and your idea was 100% the best. Like, usually we take some of what you said and some of my background and we're like, well, maybe this would be how we would respond.
Yeah.
And it's not even like we're spinning the conversation trying to convince each other that the other one's right or better. It's just like, you might say an idea and then I'm like questioning, and then oftentimes the question you ask me is, well, is that helping the heart, or is that just a quick fix? That's kind of your like go-to point back question.
Yeah.
But we kind of ask ourselves that question in both our answers, like, and then we usually, I would say, I mean, honestly, we don't even sit there and be like, this is the exact, I don't think we ever really come up with an exact thing that we would do, because we're not actually doing it at the moment.
Right.
So it's more just like you said, revealing those past things that we already come into our marriage with. But I think that more times than not, it helps us to get better at communicating and finding a compromise. And that's not even the purpose of the conversation.
Right.
But I'm just like thinking about that right now. I think that the way we've communicated about scenarios that aren't necessarily relevant to us personally, we've been able to compromise on it, and it's probably helped our communication, because it's not as stressful and it's not tense, because it's not actually something we have to deal with right now. It's just, let's figure out what we might do in the future. And it's us practicing getting on the same team, even though we might not start on the same team at the beginning.
Yeah. Well, and also I think it's healthy just for us, as I'm talking to you about like what are my initial thoughts on a particular thing, like thinking through that and forming that myself to where I have to form a conversation and form an opinion around it and vocalize that. Like I'm solidifying and understanding where I'm coming from. And so it's helpful even for just me, as I'm telling you, of like, this is where I'm coming from and why. And maybe even in the middle of saying that, I realize like, maybe that's not a good place that I'm coming from. And
I think it also is healthy, and just like we're like, again, we're not dealing with it in the moment, so we're practicing that pause and coming together and figuring out, okay, we want to deal with the heart of this situation, not just fixing it. So let's think about it, let's pray about it together. what, and we're just analyzing it, and maybe in the future that will help us to not just respond instantaneously in the moment, which I'm sure we'll still do plenty of times, but it's just that practice of how do we have a full conversation about this and come to an agreement of what we think is best moving forward. And it's not just one-sided, and it's also not a spur of the moment instantaneous fix. It's a thoughtful conversation of, this is where I came from, this is where I'm coming from, and this is what God says, so what are we going to do with it?
Right. I think maybe a specific example of this that we've kind of talked about a couple times is just how different our backgrounds were on this is with video games. And it's kind of silly, but when, I grew up playing video games with my brother, and I played way too many hours of video games, and I
don't know that that's really that different in parenting style as much as it is, because my brother definitely got to play video games quite a bit.
No, for sure, but I'm saying when we've had that conversation,
our opinions are definitely different.
Your opinion is more so.
Yeah.
I want to be way more cautious on allowing our kids to play video games. And when we were first starting this conversation, my opinion was like, but I want to share those memories with my son playing video games, just like I did with my brother, just like I did with my dad sometimes.
And then you're like, they build hand-eye coordination.
Yeah, okay. There's good reason for it. There's horrible reasons for it. Anyways, my point is initially we were on not on opposite ends of the spectrum, because we both, even at the very early stage, I recognized it's not great for a kid to be playing 6 hours of video games every day. I understand that. But we were differing in that opinion, and more than anything, it just revealed to each other of where we are initially in that conversation. And in the first few minutes, pretty much every time we've had that conversation, in the first few minutes, it's like, okay, Brittany knows that I grew up and loved playing video games. And so she knows that's where all this is coming from. And I know that as someone who didn't play as many video games and didn't enjoy them and doesn't see any benefit in them.
Not that there's not any.
That it is harder. She doesn't see the value in letting our kids play that. And so that's our starting point. And so I think from there, when you come to that realization of, this is where she was at, this is where I'm at.
And neither of us are 100% wrong or 100% right.
Right. But then you can begin to funnel that conversation into, okay, that's where we're at. Now what wisdom does the Lord have to give to us in moving forward with this conversation? And that's kind of like that present aspect of parenting and sorting these things out. And that it is a listening to the Lord. It is a process of discovering what the Lord is leading us in, and how to move forward with any given problem or example or anything that we might be sorting through and trying to work out together.
Yeah, and again, obviously that is something that, one, we haven't sat down and said, all right, we're going to allow our kid to play X minutes a month. We haven't even...
Right.
It's not like we have some... we're not crazy people with some future parenting plan book somewhere written all down.
Yeah.
But that just having that conversation, even though it's not relevant at all, backs it all the way up to now where we're at is just screen time in general. And that kind of started changing. I think both of our ideas was just how we wanted to introduce screen time to Emerson in the first place. And I think that will shape how we keep that in our home moving forward. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I think we've shared a little bit about that, but that we didn't really allow much screens at all for the first year. Very, very rare. And now it's little bits, but I think that just backing it up to, okay, what's the reason that not just enjoyment, not just I think it's a waste of time, but like what are the genuine benefits that it would be for him, or is there other things that he might still get the same benefits, but it's also not so many negative aspects in the same.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, I think just having those conversations, even though it's not relevant, it did have relevance in how we had our initial screen time conversation, which was very relevant already, and is something that we are changing and working through as he gets older. But it was something we started when he was basically a baby. I mean, when he was, we knew he was already looking at the TV, and we didn't want to overstimulate screens, so we just didn't. But I think that plays into the relevance later, even though that wasn't relevant now.
Right.
If you're looking for some of the softest clothes with the cutest designs for your little one, then check out Wild Robin Boutique. They specialize in organic baby clothing with neutral tones and earthy patterns, and they provide quality fabrics without sacrificing comfort, style, or your budget. Wild Robin Boutique was founded by a fellow stay-at-home mom and Christ follower. She has a heart for families and little ones, so be sure to check out her site linked in the show notes to give her some support and pick out something for a kiddo in your life.
Well, I think about Deuteronomy chapter 6 of like parents teach your children these things as they rise to wake and as they go to sleep and as they walk along the way. And when we were thinking about screen time and that whole thing of just like how to determine how to navigate that, it wasn't so much that there's like a specific verse in the Bible that says, okay, if your kid has over an hour of screen time, then they're in sin, right? That's nowhere. And there isn't a specific verse that that told us exactly what to do on how to navigate screen time. And I'm sure there will be many problems. I know there will be many problems. That there is not a verse that specifically and explicitly tells us how to handle something and what to do in any given situation. But I think the wisdom from Deuteronomy 6 is that in order to have the kind of relationship with your children, to be able to have those conversations throughout the day, to be able to hold their attention, to be able to have a relationship with them, that you are able to speak into their lives and they listen, and all these different things. And I'm just giving this as an example, not as like a perfect that we do it perfectly.
Oh yeah.
But the wisdom from Deuteronomy 6 led us, and from other places in the Bible, but that wisdom led us to, we want to limit screen time because we want to have those interactions where we're rolling on the floor with him and playing around with him rather than sitting in front of a screen together, where the engagement comes from a screen rather than with mom or dad. And that doesn't mean that there isn't a place for screen time in our home. Like Brittany says, we do that. We allow for screen time now. But that initial caution into even allowing it in the first place was because we first and foremost wanted to develop the relationship with our son and be able to form that bond that is so important in these early years. And so I think that's the place that as you're having these conversations with your spouse, like it has got to turn back to Scripture and the wisdom that the Lord gives, and that through understanding and reading the biblical story, you begin to see the wisdom of how do I parent in specific situations through a general context that's revealed in Scripture.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think oftentimes when we are sharing our past parenting experience, whether that was how we were raised or, like you said, a friend or family member that we saw raise their kids, or even like recent, like we leave somebody's house and we see something, like whenever we're sharing those, I think oftentimes our initial response is, I already have the whole solution figured out. This is what I would do. And we haven't sought scripture and we haven't listened to our spouse yet, but we think we already have the best answer sometimes. Mm-hmm. And I think that that when that's the case, a lot of the times I think there's some fear associated with the situation, and that's why we already have the answer in our head. So like another example that you said when we were talking about this earlier was, and this is another like kind of silly one, but there's not a Bible verse that says you need to protect your kid at all costs so that they never get hurt, or where that line is of letting them explore, letting them potentially be on the edge of maybe breaking a bone, maybe scraping their knee, you know, like the chance of breaking a bone would be slim. But like, I'm thinking like, you know, a 3-year-old or 2-year-old climbing on some climbing thing at a playground that is safe completely for a 7-year-old, but maybe not a 3-year-old.
Or like Emerson, climbing on something that isn't a climbing thing and trying to look out the window.
Yeah. So at what point do we like let them explore while still being right there? There's not a line of that. And you know, my first instinct, obviously, and I think a lot of moms' first instinct is, don't do that. You're going to get hurt. Get down. Like, we're not even going to let you attempt to learn how to climb because you're going to get hurt. And so whenever Nathan's like, let him do it, I'm like, no, he could get hurt. And it's just that, like, sometimes his instinct is like, well, if he gets hurt, he'll learn. You know, not even from, like, neither of us are wrong, but
not
it's just
that I want him to get hurt.
No, yeah. I'm just saying, like, I don't know. And both of our ideas of the worst thing that could happen in that situation are obviously also different. I'm over here like, he could break a bone, and you're like, no, the likelihood of that is next to nothing. He would probably just cry for a second and he'll be fine. Like, but that's just another silly thing to say. My initial response might be, let's protect Emerson at all costs and not let him climb on stuff, and that's out of the fear of not wanting to get hurt. And if we were to like back up and really evaluate that, we'd say, well, you know, that's probably not the best idea, because if he never learns to climb, then one, he's still going to be doing it when I'm not around, because he's a boy and he's already wants to do whatever he thinks he can do. And if I'm not there to, like, I don't know, not tell him what to do, but to help him in the learning of it, and he does it when we're not around, then yeah, there's a higher chance of him getting hurt, for one. And two, if we like wait way longer to let him learn how to do something, it's like there's also more of a chance of him getting hurt in the long run. So I say all that to say, my initial reaction to wanting to respond the way that I might want to respond is out of fear. And I think that can be carried on to just with newborns, especially a lot of the decisions that we initially want to make. If we really were to think about why, and I think that's the hard part of, like, when I have my initial reaction of I want to respond in this way, I'm not gonna initially think, oh, I'm scared, like I'm being fearful. But when I think about it, I'm like, well, that probably wasn't really from God, and we didn't really agree on it as a couple. That was just out of fear. Yeah. And with your first baby for sure, but I'm sure it'll happen again with our second. Like, it's really easy to make a whole lot of decisions out of fear, whether that's related to family, whether that's related to just simply how you think that you should raise them and let them sleep and all the different things. And but it's important to make sure that we are realizing that the decision we're about to make is really out of fear and not out of what's best for Emerson necessarily in the long run or even in the moment, and what's best for the family or the friends that we're impacting or the relationships that we're impacting. And just, I don't know.
Yeah, I think if and we had an episode on this a while ago about, like, as parents, we are ambassadors. We are the ambassadors of Christ to our kids. And if that's the case, if we are supposed to be reflections of the Father to our children, then the character and the qualities of the father should also be present in our parenting as well. And just like you said, fear is not a quality of the father. And so in the same way, like there is so much there's so much noise in our culture. There's so many different voices speaking to us and telling us what it is and what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to think and act and what we're supposed to say and all of that stuff. And it can be overwhelming trying to figure out what is the right voice in all of it. But I think if we approach from the standpoint with the lens that we want to behave, we want to live, we want to represent the Father in the way that the Bible represents the Father, with the character of grace and mercy and kindness and steadfast love that God gives his people and his children over and over and over again. And if we make decisions out of that rather than with whatever our culture is saying or whatever is the coolest thing to do as a parent or whatever that looks like, we actually had this conversation this last week of like, we were thinking back to generations before us of, the generation, one or two generations before our grandparents, and how, a lot of the boys from that generation, from 4 or 5 generations ago, were never hugged by their dad because it was just a cultural thing of like
respect, manlyhood.
Yeah, that like it wasn't the common way that your dad showed love to you by hugging you. And I remember being in a men's group, where I was the youngest one, and there was a bunch of retired senior guys, and it was the majority of the group said like, yeah, my dad never hugged me when I was a kid. And just even to that day, like they still remember that. It still stands out to them. And we would look at that today and we'd be like, that's crazy. Why would a dad not hug his child? And so I just think about that, like 4 or 5 generations from now, what is going to be looked back upon that is commonplace in our culture, commonplace in our society. And they think like, man, that's crazy. Your dad didn't do that with you. Like, and just how easy it is that what becomes common in our culture can just be accepted in our homes, good or bad. It's easy for it to just be accepted in our homes. And that's not what we want in our families. We don't want to just do what is commonplace. We don't just want to do what others are doing or for the sake of this is all I know from previous generation or past experience. But we take those things and then we analyze it against, Lord, how do you want me to love my kids? And how do you want to lead me in being a representative of who you are? How can I share my love, or how can I share your love to my kids? How can I share your grace to my kids? How can I share your mercy and your kindness to them? And what does that look like in a practical way? And I think if we're honest, that probably looks different family to family. Yeah. But in general, if we were to look across different families and be able to see the love of Christ and see the goodness of Christ, even though it may look differently in practicality, that the same qualities are there, the same characteristics are there. And I think that's what we're aiming for in these kind of conversations, is like, okay, this is at the beginning, this is where we come from. This is the ideas we've already established. Now, how does the quality and the character of the Lord lead us into finding practical solutions of how to move forward?
Yeah.
Have your allergies been acting up? Every year when the seasons change from winter to spring and from summer to fall, my allergies start bothering me. Earthly's Sinus Saver is an herbal tincture that provides natural support during allergy season. It works best when taken consistently and helps to give you relief from sneezes, sniffles, sinus pressure, watery eyes, and all those other annoying allergy symptoms. Sinus Saver uses the power of herbs to help clear the body of excess histamines and calm allergic reactions. My family is thankful for this product, knowing we are fueling our bodies with natural things to help us feel better versus the typical over-the-counter medicines that oftentimes have other side effects. I also love that it's safe for our little one. If you're interested in Earthly Sinus Saver or any of their other products, click the link in the show notes.
And I think even when we do that, there's still times where, I mean, the way we've talked, it's like at the end we're on the same page every single time. And that's definitely not the case. So there have been many conversations where we just kind of, like I said, again, not relevant in the situation, so we don't have to come to a solution in the situation, so we don't all the time. Like, it's not like we just sit there and argue and hammer it out. Not argue, but hammer it out until we come to a solution, because, again, we're not actually talking about our kid. If we were, then yes, we would have to come to a solution. But, yeah, just because we compare our past and then both look to God, we don't always just magically become on the same team. Mm-hmm. And I think that's taken multiple conversations and multiple breaks in the conversations and praying about it on our own, and maybe even doing more research on our own, about depending on what the conversation's about, and then coming back and we have it again a couple weeks later. And I think that doing that now, like I said, on stuff that's not something we have to know now, is healthy, because it's giving us the opportunity to start forming an opinion and start trying to get on the same team about something that very well could come up in our future. And we've been talking about it for 5 years, not waiting until it happens. And then now we have to agree at the mm-hmm. same moment. And I think that we even saw that before Emerson was born. We talked about so many definitely not everything, but so many of how we wanted to do this, how we wanted to do that with the baby, that we had the time to have a lot of those conversations before he was here. It wasn't mm-hmm. like he just arrived and then we're like, okay, well, what are we going to do about this? Like I said, there's definitely been those things, but now we're to the stage of he's a toddler, and ever since he started walking, it's like, okay, well, we got to figure out how to parent completely different than we've been parenting this whole time. And he's starting to understand stuff, and he's starting to throw a little bit of fits. So, like, what do we want to do now mm-hmm. that when he is getting older and starts to understand, it will make sense? Like, not that we are going to do the same thing now to help calm down a tantrum that we're going to do when he's 5, but what are we doing now that builds up, that's all connected, and he's just now starting this new phase, and we're already having the conversations and trying to figure out how are we going to parent this? How would we parent this when he's 5? And then back up, okay, well, what can we do now that sets us up to be able to parent him in that way when he's 5? Mm-hmm. And just having those conversations before it's so pressing, so that you have the time to be on the same team. You have the time to both go to God separately and together, and to find that wisdom, and to really hear each other out, and to analyze, am I making this decision out of a wrong motive, or is this my instinct because it's what God told me is my instinct? Mm-hmm. And if that's the case, then God, can you help my spouse to see what you have revealed to me? If you firmly believe that your instinct is from God, and just allowing that space to figure out how you want to parent something before you're in the very middle of it.
Yeah. I think getting ahead of things like what you're talking about is super helpful in just seeking that unity with each other, mm-hmm. being on the same page with each other, because it allows, time is a great thing. That time allows opportunity for a change of heart, a change in perspective. Like as we're processing something that may come 5 to 10 years down the road. Well, 2 years from now, I may have a completely different outlook on that. I may have completely come around to your point of view and your...
And I think we've already seen that in some ways.
For sure.
Not even just in parenting, but just in different conversations we've had that we might have had conflict about right when we got married that we're very much on the same page about now. And it's not because we argued about it for the last 3 years. It's because God kind of shaped and changed both of our hearts to where they align more than they did 3 years ago.
And I think that's one of the things, if, just thinking about like maybe the people listening, of like whatever context you're at right now with you and your spouse, or on having these conversations or whatever, that the hope in marriage, the goodness in marriage, when you're seeking after the Lord and you're pursuing a godly marriage and you want that's what both of you want, then the hope and the goodness is that Jesus will create that unity. And that it's a lifelong commitment. It's a lifelong journey. That as much as Brittany and I are unified today, we've got nothing on us 30 years down the road. Like, we will be much more unified 30 years from now than we are today. And not that we aren't today. We're much more unified today than we were 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And that will continue to be the case. And so there's goodness in that this is a lifelong commitment, and that obviously in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, we're still sorting some things out. And we always will be, but we're growing closer in that unity with one another as we seek after the Lord. And so there's goodness there. There's hope there. And so if that's just something you're struggling with, then lean into that trust in the Lord that He is working on both of your hearts. And that's a good place to start.
Yeah. And I would even say that as you're praying about, we kind of talked, this kind of hits on another podcast I think we talked about, of like when you want your spouse to change. And this is different in that you might want your spouse to change their mind. And when you're just praying on whatever that thing is, and if you're both disagreeing about it, there's a good chance both of you want your spouse to change your mind right in the moment. And just being cautious of, like, as we're praying about that, I'm not praying, God, can you just help Nathan to see exactly what I see? Because then I'm going to miss what He wants to do in my mind or in my life through that situation. It's, can you help us? Can you give us both a piece about what the best thing is? And can you reveal wisdom to both of us so that we know that it's from you? And when we have that conflict and then we come back together and we're closer on the same team than we were, I think it's just so evident that God answered that, and He did change both of our hearts. And it's not because I said I missed out on what He wanted to do in me because I just wanted Him to change His mind. It's God, can you, if He's right, then show me that. If I'm completely wrong, show me that. Or if there's a better way, then can you reveal that to both of us so that we know what your idea is, and it's not either of our personal idea.
Right. And being able to think that way requires us to think about our spouse in a particular manner. That I have to recognize, maybe Brittany is smart. Maybe she does. Maybe she does, have come from a place of experience, come from a place of understanding, come from a place of wisdom. Maybe she is seeking after the Lord in this answer just as much as I am. And if I'm able in the moment, and it's really hard to do in the moment because, especially when you're disagreeing, but in the moment, if I can come to a place of like, okay, she's not just saying these things because she wants me to be wrong, but she's saying these things because she genuinely thinks this is the best direction. And if I can recognize that in the moment, then the conversation doesn't just become, how do I get her to think the way that I want her to think? The conversation becomes, how do we partner together and move forward in what we think is best? And sometimes that means that even though I don't 100% agree with what we decide to do, or I may think that, like, okay, I'm willing to move forward in this decision, but I don't know if it's going to turn out the way we want it to. That one, I have to trust in my spouse. I have to trust in my wife, recognizing that I married her for a reason, because I think she is much more wise than me. I think she is much smarter than me. And to trust her in that moment. Believing in my spouse to be who I thought she was when she walked down the aisle, and who I have come to know her to be since that day. And so there's that aspect of it. And there's also an aspect of trusting that we're not going to get it right every time, no matter how many conversations we have. And so that the Lord is working even more than we are, that God is the one leading us and guiding us. And part of the biblical story is that humanity gets it wrong, and we don't do things right even when we think we're doing it right. But the Lord is good, and he's gracious to show us when that happens, and lead us in the right direction after that. And so to trust in Brittany, number one, trust her as my spouse, that we are unified together, and that as we come to a decision, even if it's not one that I am like, yes, she finally agreed with me. Like, maybe we met in the middle. Maybe we decided to go with her idea, whatever that looks like. That she is my spouse, and I will lean on her as my partner, and someone who I have placed my trust in and believe in. And that too, that the Lord is working in our lives, in our kids' lives, even if we don't get things perfect, and we're not going to get things perfect. And the third thing is, if and when that happens, and when we don't get things right, to not be resentful against your spouse, of like, well, we went with your idea and look where it got us. But to recognize that you're moving forward together. When Brittany's ideas are successful, then we're successful as a team. When my ideas fail, we fail as a team.
Yeah.
And so because you are unified in marriage, it is no longer two of you, but two have become one, and you move forward together. And so as you're navigating those difficult conversations, that you do it from the perspective of those three things.
Yeah. And I would say, like, just kind of one more thing to tag on to that is that you do come up with a solution, whether it's, like you said, whether it was his idea, whether it was something in the middle, whether it was my initial idea, but that you come up with something and move forward in that together. Because if you don't, then you're both going to handle it differently when you're the one in charge, or you're the one taking care of your kid, or whatever. And then, for one, that's not beneficial for your child at all. They're confused, and there's no, like, yeah, it's just not, like, even when it's difficult to agree or come up with a solution, I think that the most important thing in that moment is to agree on something, whether it was, like I said, whatever, meet in the middle, one idea, the other, whatever it was, and move forward in that together. And if it doesn't work, you come back and reevaluate, and you agree on something and move forward in that together. And your kids see that you're unified in what you're doing, not in that we're being two separate parents. Because I think that could create all kinds of issues of, like, not knowing which parent to ask what, just the whole, depending on what it is, especially as they get older. But just being we, like you just said, we are unified. We are supposed to be acting as one, and our kids should see that in how we parent them. They should see that we are on the same team. Even when in our bedroom and we're having the conversation, we might not be in complete agreement, but when we're talking to them, we're on the same team, because they need to see mom and dad on the same team more than they need to see that mom's way was best or dad's way was best. That doesn't matter. This is mom and dad parenting you together, and we decided on this together, and we're moving forward in this. And then, like I said, if it doesn't work and we need to change, then mom and dad are changing this together, and we're moving forward in this, not one or the other.
Yeah, for sure. So that's just kind of our thoughts on just how we approach like these parenting moments or thoughts, or just like specific examples that we think of and we process together, and just how to talk through that, how to be on the same page with your spouse. One of the things that I really love from a pastor, his name is John Tyson. He has this book called Intentional Father. And then a course called The Primal Path that's all about like dads and sons, and how dads raise their sons and be intentional in their lives. One of the things he says is one of the jobs of a parent is to dam up the brokenness and pass on the blessing. And in all three of these things, in the context of the parenting baggage that we bring to these conversations and bring to our marriages, that there is brokenness and there is blessing. And so we analyze of like, okay, where have we seen the brokenness in our culture and our families and the things around us? Whatever we bring to the table of what parenting should look like, where's the brokenness in that? And we recognize those things and we stop them. And then we recognize, okay, where's the blessing been in what we bring to the table? And we pass that on to our kids. And same thing for when we look at the biblical story. There's plenty of examples in the Bible where parents got it wrong and families got it wrong. And so we look at the story and we want to avoid those things and pass on the blessing of seeking after God and knowing Him. And so we dam up the brokenness and we pass on the blessing. And as we process that with our spouse and we seek unity with our spouse in a decision moving forward. Brittany mentioned it, that we want to parent the heart of our kids, not just the symptom, not just the action or the behavior. We want to parent the heart. And so in those moments, as we seek for specific solutions to be unified with our spouse and moving forward, in how do we pass on blessing to them by moving forward together in the way that we think is most wise and best to go. And then when we get it wrong, we move forward again, damming up the brokenness, damming up an unwise decision or a failed decision or whatever that might be, and we move forward again, seeking to pass on the blessing to our children. So we hope this was helpful. We are praying for you guys, for those who listen, and just for families to be able to have these conversations and spouses to be able to have these conversations that point us back to Christ, that remind us of the goodness that He has given us and the love that He has for us, and how in being unified with our spouse, in loving our children and leading our children, that we ourselves become more like Christ. So, again, every ending episode with, we just want to say thank you for all the people who listen, who support us. And specifically, we've had a couple people give us ratings and reviews on their specific listening app or platform that they use. And just know that is such a huge help for us. And we so appreciate that, and just really like hearing what you guys think about this podcast, and what has stood out to you, what what is meaningful, all those things. Ultimately for the glory of God, not for us, but for the glory of Him and what He can do through us. So thank you guys so much. We'll see you guys next week. Bye.